Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today, my guest is Timothy Watson, a.k.a. Tim Spearman. Now, here is the interesting thing about Tim. He's the author of a number of books, but today he's going to talk about Goodbye, Ruby Akhtar. This is a very interesting book that I think you'll want to hear about. So let me just introduce Timothy to our show, and then we'll talk all about his new book and various other things that he does that you're going to find very, very interesting. So welcome to the Susan Brender Show, Timothy Spearman.
Thank you. Call me Timothy, sure.
Yeah, well, no problem, Timothy. Now, Timothy, let me ask you a few things. First, I'd like to know all the books that you wrote, and tell our audience what their names are and why you wrote those particular books.
Yeah, sure. Some of my books are being reissued. I'm going with a different publisher based in the UK, but just briefly, I'll give you a rundown. My autobiography is called Sailing the Seven Seas. The seven C's stand for: first you need confidence, then you will have courage, then you'll take calculated chances and strive to be a champion, a conqueror, and hopefully a Caesar. It's a success formula that was given to me by Judy Garland's agent, whose name was Tiger Ray McKendrick, and he lived in the Church Street area of Toronto. I met him some years back. Yeah.
Now, hold on a minute, Timothy. Why would this person whom you're talking about, why would he give you information? I wonder, just tell us how that happened.
Well, I just met him. I mean, there's all kinds of events around the city, and we just bumped into him, and then he invited us back to his pad, and he loved to drink G&T, and so we went and joined him on a few occasions, and he told us stories and showed us pictures of he and Judy Garland and his past as an agent with Hollywood greats, and so it was interesting. Yeah, it was one of those things, one of those people that you manage to bump into in life.
Yeah. Now, so you bumped into Judy Garland's manager. That must have been a wonderful, exciting opportunity. Now, who are some of the other people that you've met that you feel are very special?
I met Indira Gandhi's cabinet minister, Dr. S.S. Mahapatra. He was in the same plenary session as I was when we attended a UN conference. It was a peace conference, and it was held in Seoul, Korea, and we met and became very good friends. I had some things to say about 9/11 because it wasn't too long after the September 11th attacks of 2001, and I think that my comments really grabbed him. He was quite intrigued, and so we ended up talking.
Yeah, so what did you talk about? You just mentioned that you had some comments about what happened on September 11th. Now, I think our audience, even though it's a long time ago and there was a lot of talk about that, and there was all this controversy, and it created quite a horrible thing. So what did you talk about?
Well, at that time, there were irregularities in the response to the emergency, and I raised the issue of Operation Northwoods, which was a plan hatched by the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in 1962, which was presented to John F. Kennedy. And it was a plan to take a jumbo jet from Langley Air Force Base, which, by the way, just happens to be where Richard B. Myers was stationed, who was the head of the Air Force on September 11th, 2001. Mm-hmm. Langley Air Force Base is known to be a CIA Air Force base. They were going to take a jumbo jet and paint it to make it look like a passenger airliner, and they were going to have a fake passenger list on board. And they were going to basically take names off death registers and bring these people back to life, in terms of an operation, and make them appear as if they were on board. And then they were going to shoot it down with a missile, this jumbo jet, painted to look like a passenger airliner, but there would be no one on board. It would be flown by remote control. And then they were going to stage fake funerals for the bereaved families of the undead or the fake dead. Now, this is a plan that went back to 1962. So, if they were thinking of orchestrating something like that then, what might they be able to pull off on September 11th, 2001? So anyway, Operation Northwoods is a document that's now declassified, and I obtained it from the National Security Archives of George Washington University back in this time period that I'm speaking of, which is not too long after the September 11th attacks of 2001.
But Tim, why would they keep that a secret? This is an important and very, very special document. Now, you're saying that they were doing very interesting things, but when I say interesting, I don't really mean interesting. They were doing dark and secretive and horrible things. Why would they do that?
Well, they didn't do it. That's the point. Operation Northwoods was never approved, but I just brought it up so that people realized what kinds of operations could have been in effect. Now, the military-industrial complex needs pretext in order to launch foreign wars. George Orwell in 1984 described a three-block world, and in several passages in the novel, he talked about how sometimes the communities would attack themselves in order to blame the attack on an imaginary enemy in order to justify foreign wars. And the wars served the purpose of culling populations and keeping them in check, but also gave them a pretext or a reason for launching a war against an imagined foreign foe.
Now, an imagined foreign foe, that also sounds pretty, I don't know how to call it. Do I say it's a controversy? Do I say that it is a problem that exists and nobody knows about it? What do you think? Why would they, again, I have to ask you, why would they do that?
I've just explained. If you need a pretext for launching a war, then you need some kind of event that seems to have taken place, which you can blame on an imaginary enemy.
But why a war? Why does anybody want a war?
Because the military-industrial complex benefits from war. That's what the presidents like Eisenhower warned about, that if the government ever became, if it ever fell under the control of the military-industrial complex, it could be something that could jeopardize the fate of the nation. So there were warnings about it.
Yeah. So, okay, so now we're talking about one of the things that you had the opportunity to investigate and to understand a little bit more. Now let's move on. So that's the book that you started. It was a book about you. What was the next book you wrote about?
Oh, there's many. I mean, one book was called Butterfly Dreams, which was about the residential school system that was run here in Canada, where Native children were taken away from their homes and put in residential schools where they were forced to basically give up all of their cultural practices and be acculturated in the Canadian way, which is basically a culture of European heritage. English and French are the founding linguistic, cultural roots of the country itself, but we have the First Nations, which are the Aboriginal peoples that occupied the land before the white settlers came. But anyway, the residential school system has been very controversial. It was supposed to have been shut down in 1960, but it, in fact, carried on beyond those years, and it's been found to have committed many wrongful acts against these people, the children that attended these schools. They were abused. The history shows they were exposed to disease where if one of them had tuberculosis, there was no effort to quarantine that student, but the others were exposed to them, and other cases of neglect that have been exposed on the hiddenfromhistory.org website by Reverend Kevin Annett.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tim, everything that you're talking about is pretty dim, pretty sad, pretty horrible.
No, I don't think my life story, my autobiography, was in any way horrible. I'm not talking about things that are necessarily horrible. I am a human rights activist, so I am concerned with things of a human rights nature, but that's not all that I write about. These are just examples.
Well, okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about your new book, which is Goodbye, Ruby Akhtar. Now, tell my audience all about what this book was about and why you wrote about it.
I wrote about Ruby. She's a victim of child trafficking, and she became known to us through the Freedom Talk Radio network in the UK, and Andy Peacher and others that are connected with that network introduced Ruby to me, and they knew about my writing talent and the fact that I authored quite a number of books. So they asked me if I would like to write a novel about her, and so I agreed. And it's a sad story in the beginning in the sense that she was a victim of child trafficking and had been abducted from her home country of Pakistan under false pretenses. But her life is a victory over hardship and over abuse, and she's triumphed, and she's turned her life around, and it's a story of great heroism. And
So Tim, how prevalent is child trafficking?
Well, I mean, it's always been an issue. I mean, it's not something that's new. It's been practiced for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, not just child trafficking, but human trafficking in general. So people disappear from their homes, their families, their countries. They get shipped abroad. And, for example, the history of Ireland, just one country to look at, because she actually ended up being abducted to Ireland. So there was a need to talk about some of the history of Ireland and its history of child trafficking and of human trafficking and so on.
Yeah.
And, there was a slave trade involving Irish people and Irish women and children. And there were actually more Irish slaves sent to the Americas and to the Caribbean islands and so forth during the 17th and 18th century than there were African slaves. So it's a history that has been suppressed, and not many people bring it up or discuss it or want to look at it.
Well, I understand that because everybody thinks that the slave trade from Africa was the main trade, and there were millions of people who were taken advantage of, but nobody thinks about Ireland. Now, Ireland, why Ireland?
Well, I mean, the English were at war with Ireland, so those that became prisoners became people with no rights. And the country was under colonial occupation, and so they were regarded as the enemy, plus they were a Catholic country and England was a Protestant country, so it wasn't just a question of cultural chauvinism based on tribal and ethnic identity, but also on religious sectarian lines. There was animosity and hatred between the two groups.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about Ruby. Ruby, you say that Ruby was born to a Jewish family in Pakistan, and she was married off to a 34-year-old pedophile. Oh, my God. Now,
as she describes it, yeah.
Yeah, so tell a little bit more about the story of Ruby.
Well, it's a difficult story because it happened so many years ago, and she's doing her best to recall and to recount events based on memories that stem back to childhood. But she remembers that there was some complicity on the part of her own relatives, and the difficulties of culture come into the picture, and the fact that she had been rumored to have been carrying on some type of relationship with a local Muslim boy, which cast aspersions on her good character and made her father become concerned about her and her reputation and the type of fallout that might fall back on the family, because Muslims were forbidden to become involved with Jews and Christians, and vice versa. The Jewish groups in the area were usually discouraged from having any involvement with the Muslim community. So it would have created, let's just say, difficulties, if not life-threatening difficulties. So in the end, the father kind of relented, even though he was protective of his daughter and felt that it might be the best thing for her and the family's safety. He was basically tricked and cajoled into this matter, and then the person that abducted her made himself out to be someone who was basically impotent and just wanted someone that would be suitable for him as a mate, and a child bride was what he was looking for, because he claimed that if he were to choose someone of his own age group, they wouldn't be interested in him because he couldn't perform, and so on. And it was, a very convoluted story, but there you go.
Well, you choose very convoluted stories. I mean, this is not the first one that's pretty difficult to understand, but what makes you, what inspires you to write about historical kinds of people and just kind of write these big, very interesting and exciting novels?
Well, I wanted to do something different. I don't want to do or rehash what has been done before or what everyone already knows about. So, I investigate things that are not widely known, and I'd also try to introduce interesting stories. Must I Remember is a novel that I wrote about an Afghan refugee family that settled in Toronto, and I was teaching them as students, and the family became friends of mine, and I thought that it would make a good novel and ultimately a good film, so I wrote this novel. And I used a Chinese myth, not a Chinese myth, but a Chinese legend about a general who, it's called Straw Men to Gather Arrows, and it's about a military strategy in which he was asked to make arrows, 100,000 arrows, and so he thought, well, the fastest way in which to gather arrows would be to devise a military strategy. And so what he did was he created these straw men, put them on a boat, and sent them across the river in the morning mist. And the enemy encamped on the other bank thought that these were attacking enemy coming in. And so they drew their arrows and shot them at these straw men. And then he towed the boats to the other side of the river and extracted the arrows, and he had more than he needed, and he had also taken a good deal of the enemy's weaponry in the process. So it was an amazing military strategy. So what I decided to do is to create straw men authors in the book so that the book is narrated and told by a series of narrators so that no one is getting the story from any one person, and it's kind of a mystery in a sense as to who the tale is actually being told by.
Right.
And so this protects those involved from reprisals from the Taliban, because much of the book is an expose of what the Taliban had done in Afghanistan, including the murder of the father and head of the household of the Rustami family.
Okay, so this is a very important thing that I feel our audience needs to know. Let's look at what's going on in the Middle East right now. How do you describe what's going on, and do you think there's going to be a war or something very horrible happening as a result of the Taliban and all those military and people who just don't have the sense of peace? What do you think's going to happen? Give our audience a little taste of what you think.
Well, there's already wars. We've had a succession of them in the Middle East, and the occupation of these countries continues. What's happening? Basically all of these wars around the world are created, and there have to be forces behind them that actually create them. In order to have a war, you need pretext, you need some catalyzing point in order to create a war. Interestingly, Paul Wolfowitz, who was part of the Bush administration, wrote a book called Project for the New American Century. 1 year before the September 11th attacks, it was published, released, and so forth. In the first paragraph, he said, America needs a catalyzing event such as a new Pearl Harbor in order to launch the project for a new American century. So that would imply that he and the neocons were devising a plan to create pretext for a foreign war that involved an attack on American soil, similar to the attack of Pearl Harbor.
Oh, my goodness. That's when you talk about scary, that's scary. Now, one of the questions I think that has to be answered is, do you think there's ever going to be peace in the Middle East?
If there is, it will be because of Israel, and there's many people in Israel that want peace. And, we get a lot of negative press about both the Israelis and the Palestinians. The truth of the matter is that many humanitarian Israelis are actually trying to help the Palestinian people, and they care deeply about them and don't wish this nonsense, I don't know whether to call it nonsense, but this tragedy, this human slaughter to continue on both sides. They want an end to it, and I think it's really in their court, and I think that we will finally see the day, and it will be because of a great resolve among the Israeli people to end this and to draw it to a peaceful close.
Yeah. So, Tim, you've been on my show before, and I asked you at that time to our audience what is in store for them and what's the last word, because you are a fabulous and an interesting man who's investigated, researched, and written a lot of books that talk all about freedom, talk about peace, talk about all these interesting people. So, Tim Watson, tell our audience, what do you want to tell them at the end of this show?
Well, I have a dream of peace. I wrote a book called The History of the Peace Train, and it's really about how the train has been used as a vehicle for spreading peace historically. Of course, it does have other darker history, as we know, with cattle trains being used to ship prisoners to concentration camps, which is not pleasant. But I wanted to look at the positive history of the train and how it has been used as a symbol of peace and as a means of, functioning as hospital trains and famine relief trains and so on throughout history. So throughout the history of the train, at least. And so I would like to see these human rights abuses of their various descriptions brought to an end, and I would like to discuss topics that are, unpleasant and sometimes taboo, because I think they need to come out and people need to be aware of these things. And it's not all, negative what I discuss in my book. Some of it is extremely uplifting and positive, and I try to end each book with some positive turnaround so that there's a feeling that the good side of us emerges in the end, and that there's some type of triumph of the human spirit. We all have dark chapters in our individual lives, in our family history, and in our national history, and in our international history. The question is solving these. I had a spiritual teacher tell me, you were given all the problems, but you were also given all the solutions. So I thought that was nice, because ultimately, what good are problems unless you can find a solution to them?
Now, last but not least, what is your call to action for our radio show listening audience?
Well, I think we need to be less sensitive and less trigger-happy and less inclined to jump on someone, and more sober and reflective, and giving people a chance to speak and air their thoughts, opinions, beliefs, etc., rather than just jumping on them, because many times they have a good message to share and a good intention behind that message, but if they're not given the proper chance to express themselves, and because of the sensitivities involved with loss of life and tragedies that have happened, people tend to just have an emotional knee-jerk reaction and get all upset when someone says something, instead of just sitting back and listening and hearing them out, right?
Yeah.
Now, so when I speak, sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Like when I speak about false flag terror operations, I know that people sometimes get upset because their impression of what happened in Boston with the Boston Marathon bombing, and their impression of what happened with the Sandy Hook school shooting and so on, is one where their emotions are involved. I mean, who likes to see children getting hurt, children getting killed? No one.
No one.
But unless we talk about these issues and try and get to the bottom of what happened and listen to each other, we're not going to end this.
Right.
We're not going to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
We have to listen to each other. And you have to be respectful to other people that share opinions that may be drastically different from yours and hear them out.
Right.
You don't have to agree with them, but you have to, in a society that you would call civilized, civil society,
mm-hmm.
you have to listen to other people. I remember at Trent University, my alma mater for undergraduate studies, they had a talk on, the abortion issue was mm-hmm. the topic, and they invited pro-choice people, and they didn't permit any pro-life activists to speak. I mean, come on. I mean,
ridiculous.
In any type of academic environment, if you want to call yourself a democratic institution with democratic ideals, you have to hear both parties, whether you agree with them or not.
Right. So what do you attribute to the fact that there are, say, TV stations or radio stations that don't have people debating it, and they only bring up one topic rather than the positive and the negative, or the kinds of subjects that lead to a good debate? What do you attribute to that?
Well, part of it is this. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth because he was teaching something that challenged the status quo and upset the apple cart. And, well, the prevailing religious opinion of Athens was that there were a pantheon of gods, that, in fact, there was a religion that was consisted of many gods. He was arguing that there was only one supreme being, and this caused great dissension, and he was vilified and ultimately made to drink hemlock, and we know what happened. He was executed. But I guess Hegel's conception of tragedy is basically that you have two agents of divergent views that cannot be reconciled, and not both of them can win. Someone's got to lose.
Right.
And I think that with someone like Socrates, you have someone who's in the minority debating with the moral majority, and chances are they're going to be scapegoated, and they're the ones that are going to be defeated in the end and have a tragic end. Mm-hmm. And what you could say is that both may intend right. The moral majority may believe that they're doing what is morally right. But when you have someone who challenges convention, tradition, or the status quo bumping up against the prevailing establishment view on some matter, then you get the opinion that this person's a troublemaker and a gadfly, when in fact they may have no reason to be provocative at all, but every reason to try to do the right thing because they believe that they are correct in their viewpoint.
Right.
Both can't win.
Right.
So someone's got to be defeated in this game. And all I can say is that I try to do what I believe is right and correct, and I share my viewpoint, and many people may disagree, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean that I'm incorrect. The historical record will show in the end who is correct. We do find out the truth generally when it comes to most historical events. It eventually comes out, and so the historical record will show who is correct in the end.
Yeah. Well, today my guest has been Tim Watson, a.k.a. Tim Spearman, and he's written many books, and he's a very interesting guy who's got a lot of beliefs and a lot of interesting things to tell you. So we could go on and on and on with Tim, but we have to say goodbye right now. And it's interesting because we also have to say goodbye to Ruby Akhtar, which is his book, and that's the name of his book. And how can they get your book, and how can they talk to you? Do you have a website, anything that tells them how they can find out more about what you wrote, what you say, what you think, anything?
At the moment, there's a fundraising effort for the book and the film to complement the book. I did send you that link. So if they would like to donate to the cause, they may. You have the link if you would be willing to share it, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
And the book will be published. We think probably it will be released around Christmas time because we will present it. It's going to be presented to a UN committee by a prominent UN official and a member of European Parliament. And then hopefully there will be efforts made to expose Ruby's case. The UN support hopefully will come into play here, and then the book should do well, and hopefully the movie to follow.
Yeah.
My website is shakespeare.com, and I've done a lot of research on the truth behind the Shakespeare authorship, and so the website title comes from the story behind that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, again, today my guest has been Tim Watson, and he's told you how you could get his book. And if you really want to tell Tim, I think whatever you think about all these wars and various things that he talked about, you can get in touch with him. And I will put the link on your site, Tim, and my site.
Thank you.
Yeah, so everybody can know where to give the money for this incredibly horrible situation, and that is child trafficking. So thank you very much, Tim, for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.